Okay, hello everybody. Welcome back to day 5 of Sociology 240. I hope that you're having a good first week. I hope that everything's working out for you. I know it's an intense course, but hopefully it's manageable for you. And of course, as always, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to get in touch with me. There are a few questions out there from folks that I'm going to be getting back to hopefully this afternoon. So don't hesitate to send me an email. You can give me a call. Of course, I'm in and out of the office, so if you do call me on my office line, leave a voicemail. That will be helpful. So our presentation for today is entitled Social versus Creative Capital, Taking the Community Question Seriously. And so we are going to talk about these two different concepts, social capital and creative capital. Try to understand these two. Try to understand how these two concepts relate to one another. And the subtitle, the sort of after the colon part of the title here, is Taking the Community Question Seriously. And you'll recall that the community question refers to this debate, this ongoing debate in the community sociology literature around this sort of issue of whether communities have been degraded by advanced capitalism and urban life and these sorts of things, or whether communities have been saved or reinvigorated or reinforced by this particular historical era, or whether that's the wrong question and communities have simply transformed, have been liberated, have changed form. And so you'll see as we go through these slides, social capital really kind of takes a Gemeinschaft sort of perspective on things and argues, well, communities have been degraded, the quality of life has been degraded, social relationships are weaker and thinner than they were in previous historical eras, and this represents a problem. The creative capital argument, which really kind of sort of echoes maybe more appropriately the kind of Gemeinschaft idea, would argue, no, communities have not been degraded, they've instead been liberated. They've changed form. We have new kinds of social relationships now that are important to us. So social capital and creative capital are two different concepts, two different ways of understanding the value of social relationships and the kinds of social relationships that are important for community life. So we'll start here with social capital and try to understand what that is. And the first thing you need to understand when we're talking about social capital, the sort of key to the argument around social capital is that civic involvement is declining. Across the board, across the United States, people are less civically involved than they have been in previous historical periods. So what actually is civic involvement? Well, it comes from the Greek word civicus, which incidentally is the same place where we get the word civilization, the word civil, the word citizen, the word city. All these words have a common root in the Greek word civicus. And so civic involvement is essentially the involvement in sort of an individual's involvement in bettering the welfare of a community. And so you might have heard the phrase like civically minded, like they say, like leaders, community leaders are civically minded. They're active in their communities. They're involved in their communities. They want their communities to be better places. They go out and volunteer with organizations. They're on the boards of organizations. They're active in the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts and the PTA. These are the people that are civically involved. And so the argument goes that that kind of involvement, that kind of engagement and caring about your community of place is less widely experienced today than it was in previous historical eras, and that represents a problem. So you might think, well, why does this actually matter? What do we care that civic involvement is declining? And the argument would be, well, social capital has economic value. It also has emotional, psychological value, public health value. And so there are lots of sort of very important material reasons why we would want to have higher levels rather than lower levels of civic involvement. And so the book written by this person called Robert Putnam, he's a Harvard political scientist, and the book that we read from for today is called Bowling Alone. And so it's important to know why this book is called Bowling Alone, right? It's an analogy. I mean, so the story goes, well, um, bowling, even though it seems like an inconsequential thing in sort of historical terms, was a very important way for people in communities to get together and have opportunities just to kind of be around each other and to talk about things, and so that those sort of informal settings in which people establish relationships and friendships and talk about things, those are the important basis for creating civic involvement. And so Robert Putnam became concerned that he noticed that even though as many people were bowling today as they were in the 1940s or 50s, but they weren't bowling in leagues anymore. They were instead bowling alone, and so he took this as a problematic symbol of the decline of civic involvement, right? So we're not bowling in leagues anymore. We're bowling alone, and that's why he called his book this. So, for example, the number of Americans attending public meetings declined 50% since the 1970s. Membership in unions, that's trade unions, labor unions, has dropped 50% since the 1950s. Membership in parent-teacher associations is down from 12 million in 1964 to 7 million today. So all of these things have meant that these organizations, these associations that have been the backbone of civic engagement, of community involvement, of social capital, their numbers are dwindling across the board, across the country. People are less involved in the PTA, less involved in these other organizations, trade unions, and so forth. And this is a problem for those of us that believe that social capital is important to quality of life. And Putnam recognizes, however, some countervailing trends, which he acknowledges, but he suggests that these don't actually call into question his thesis. So, for example, more people are involved in soccer leagues today than were in the 1950s. More people are involved in social movements, right? You've got people protesting and organizing and picketing and these sorts of things at higher rates today than you did in previous eras, perhaps the 1960s notwithstanding. And you've also got more national advocacy groups like the Sierra Club, like the AARP, the American Association of Retired Persons. There are many, many more nonprofit organizations today than there ever have been, and support groups are, a much bigger thing today than they ever have been before. And so all of these things potentially represent a sort of countervailing trend to the argument that Putnam makes that civic involvement is declining. But Putnam, so he recognizes this, he writes about it, but then he says, well, look at these kinds of activities and compare them to these other kinds of activities. And these kinds of activities are very individualistic, right? Support groups are about getting better, you individually getting better as a person, not about you making a difference in your community, right? Membership in the Sierra Club, fine, but this is a national organization, and membership is basically like, you write a check once a year and they send you some junk mail, right? I mean, that's what membership is. It's not actually you being involved in something. And so all of these things, he recognized that these trends exist, but he doesn't see them as actually representing, as challenging the argument that social capital, civic engagement is declining. So what exactly does social capital mean? Well, it refers to the value of our social networks, okay? And this is economic value, but it's also sort of psychological, emotional value, and other kinds of value as well. Our social networks, of course, are the sort of networks, the webs of people that we know. And so there are two parts to our social network or our set of social ties. Um, the first is what I refer to as the intensity of our social ties. So, first of all, the density of our social ties or our social networks is important. And the density is made up of these two things: the intensity, which is essentially how many people or how well we know the people that we know, and the extensity, which is essentially how many people we know. So it matters how well we know people, it also matters how many people we know. And so if we have denser social networks, then these are social networks in which we know more people and we know them better. And so the denser our social networks, the better our social capital, and the higher the value of our social capital. Another important piece to the story is what we call here norms, social norms around reciprocity and trust. And reciprocity is this idea that, it's basically the idea, I scratch your back and you scratch mine. And so where we have higher levels of trust with people, we have there's more likely to be a norm of reciprocity, right? So people that we don't know, we wouldn't expect them to do us favors, and they wouldn't expect that we would do them favors. But when you get to know people and you establish a relationship with people and there's rapport and there's trust, then you might expect people to do you favors, and you might expect there's a norm around you're sort of going to reciprocate. Like, this morning, true story, boring as hell, but totally true. This morning, my neighbor came over to my house with his ladder so that I could get up on my roof and clean my gutters. And, you know, he's my neighbor, and he's a person that I know from the neighborhood and also from ISU. And so it was because of that, and I just kind of bumped into him on the street, and we got to talking about the gutters, and then he was like, I'll come over with my ladder. And, if you don't know your neighbors, if you don't have those kinds of social relationships with the people around you, then that sort of thing doesn't happen. So that right there is an example of the value of social capital, the value of knowing the people around you, the density, right? How many people you know and how well you know them. And of course, there's a norm of reciprocity, right? So I didn't right away go clean his gutters, but I owe him one. He knows I owe him one. I know I owe him one, and I'm going to find a way at some point to compensate him for that favor. And that's what we mean by norms of reciprocity. This idea that I scratch your back, you scratch mine. And so the denser our social networks are, the better off we are. And this is what sociologist Bill Freudenberg has referred to as the density of acquaintanceship. And so, kind of finally we think to ourselves, well, why is this concept that we're learning about here, why is it called social capital? Why not just call it civic involvement or social networks? What added value do you get out of calling it social capital? And I guess the answer to that question is when you call it social capital, that really underscores the idea that you're going to get a return on your investment, right? Capital is money that you invest. It's, if you just have $1 and you go to the store and buy gum, it's not capital, it's currency. But if you take that same dollar and you invest it with the expectation that you'll get not only the principal back, the original dollar, but some added amount of money, a return on your investment, a dividend, then that becomes capital. And so when we call this social capital, it's a metaphor, right? It's not real capital. But when we call it social capital, the reason we call it social capital is because that term underscores the idea that this is something that can be invested. Okay, so there are two kinds of social capital, and this is particularly important. What we call here bonding and bridging social capital. And so bridging social capital is the stuff that connects one group to another, Bonding social capital is the stuff that coheres a group to itself. Let me say this one more time. Bonding social capital is the stuff that coheres a group to itself. Bridging social capital is the stuff that connects one group to another group. And so you can have different configurations of bridging and bonding social capital which create different kinds of community dynamics. And those kinds of configurations here are represented on this diagram. And so here we have on the x-axis a continuum from lowest bonding to highest bonding. On the y-axis we have a continuum from lowest bridging to highest bridging. And so we've simplified the set of arrangements you can have. You can basically have with this diagram 4 different kinds of communities. The best kind of community to have is a community that has high bridging social capital and high bonding social capital, and that's going to be this type of community represented by the upper right hand quadrant of this diagram. So if you've got high bridging and high bonding, you have a community characterized by progressive participation. So lots of broad coalitions of people in the community who are strongly bonded to each other, but also that bridge to other groups inside and outside of the community to produce progressive participation. You can also have a circumstance where you've got high bonding social capital, but low bridging social capital. So the groups are bonded to each other, but they're not connected between groups. And that would be represented by the lower right-hand quadrant here. And so if you've got high bonding and low bridging, you end up with a community characterized by strong boundaries and a lot of mistrust among groups and little cooperation, right? So a community that is very distrustful of outsiders, for example, would be a community that would be characterized by high bonding and low bridging. Another type of social group that might be characterized by high bonding and low bridging would be like a gang, right? So gangs are very tight-knit groups of people, right? The people that are in the gang, I mean, these people are your brothers, your siblings, and so very tight-knit, but not a lot of trust, not a lot of bridging with other groups outside of the gang, right? And so that would be a kind of organization that would be characterized by lots of bonding social capital, but very little, maybe no bridging social capital. Now, if you have a community with low bonding and low bridging, then you have a community characterized by extreme individualism, and that's the lower left quadrant of this diagram. And so that would be the kind of community where basically every person is out for themselves. Every person is out for themselves, and so people are super competitive. They're always, they're not helping other people. They're only trying to take care of themselves, and so it's very individualistic. And when you have a community that's very individualistic, nobody's looking out for the marginal groups in the community, right? So the poor, or the elderly, or the disabled, or whatever it would be, these marginal groups in the community get left out. Nobody's looking out for them. And then finally, you could have a circumstance in which you have high bridging but low bonding. And that would be represented by the upper left-hand quadrant here. And that would be a community characterized by clientelism. Clientelism is something very akin to what John McKnight, in his chapter on the professional problem, would refer to as transforming citizens into clients, right? Clientelism is another way of saying transforming citizens into clients. If you go back to day 2 PowerPoints, you can revisit the stuff on John McKnight. And so, so this high bridging, low bonding is kind of another way of talking about the professional problem. If you have low bonding, that means people in the community aren't very connected to each other, but you have high bridging, so lots of connections outside of the community, mobilizing resources outside of the community, then people in the community come to think of themselves as clients. all the social change that happens is driven by external forces, external resources, rather than the people in the community doing things for themselves. Okay? So this is the difference between bonding and bridging social capital, and this is the way these two things interact with each other. Very important to know. So why do we care about social capital? Well, we get jobs through social capital, right? So, you know, very few of us are actually going to get jobs through classified ads or Craigslist or the newspaper or any of these things. Most of us get jobs because of who we know. It's a dirty little secret of American labor market. We get jobs because of who we know. Well, if you don't know anybody, you ain't getting a job, right? And so it's important for you to know people. We get jobs because of who we know. Now, of course, you don't get jobs by, your best friend or your sibling isn't going to be the person that gets you a job. And the reason why your best friend or your sibling or your cousin isn't going to be the person that gets you a job is because they know you too damn well to trust you. So most of the jobs that we will get will be through acquaintances, not really close, what anthropologists might call primary ties. We get our jobs through acquaintances. We get our jobs through friends of friends of friends, right? Because those people don't know us well enough to know that they probably should hire us or trust us. Um, and this is what economic sociologist Mark Granovetter has referred to as the strength of weak ties, weak social ties, right? So acquaintances are weak ties. Our buddies, our brothers, our family members, these are our strong ties or primary ties. Our acquaintances, friends of friends, these are our weak or secondary ties. And so we tend to get our jobs through our weak or our secondary ties, not through our primary ties, but social capital is still incredibly important. Um, and so that's one reason why it matters. Another reason is that social capital makes us safer. And this stands to reason, right? There is, if you know your neighbors, you know the people around you, and you're invested in them and you care about them, then you're going to be looking out for them. And if you know that your neighbors are on vacation and you see a light on or something like that, you're probably going to call the police, or you see a weird car in the driveway or something like that. So it makes us safer in that regard. It also makes us safer because if you know your neighbors and you care about them, you're less likely, even if you're hard up, you're less likely to break into their house and steal their, laptop or something. Because if you get caught, it's not just that you get in trouble, it's that these people that you know and that you care about are going to lose faith in you. And so there's a built-in kind of like peer pressure mechanism that keeps us from performing, enacting quote-unquote deviant behavior in places with high levels of social capital, right? There's this old, I listen to rap music from the 90s, and there's this old De La Soul song that has this line in it, neighborhoods are now hoods because nobody's neighbors. And it's not a throwaway line. It's like a really I mean, think about that. That's exactly this idea. The better we get to know the people around us, the safer, the more integrated, and the more sort of resilient our communities are, right? And so, well, anyway, I won't make this whole lecture about a De La Soul record, but you can look it up on the YouTube. It's called Stakes is High. It's a good song. So, high social capital makes our neighborhoods more vibrant, right? I mean, if we know the people around us, we care about the people around us, we're gonna have barbecues in the backyard and have them over. We're gonna have block parties and it's gonna be vibrant. It's gonna be a pleasant place to be. When you don't know the people around you, you're not invested in them, and you don't care about them, and they're not invested in you, then you're not out on the street, you're not interacting with these people, you're just locked in your basement like Netflix or whatever. And so when there's high levels of social capital, right? We have a community that's dynamic, a community that enjoys being with itself, and a community that's vibrant. And that makes quality of life it makes it higher. It improves quality of life. So with high social capital, we're happier. Our quality of life is better. Our emotional health is better, right? We are social animals. We need to be around people. And also, finally, and perhaps most importantly, um, it makes us more economically resilient. And how does that work? Well, if you live in a place that's characterized by high social capital, and then all of a sudden, like the I don't know, automobile assembly plant closes, or the mine closes, or whatever it is, and all of these people that had jobs suddenly don't. In other words, the community economy experiences what we would call a sort of external economic shock. Well, if we know our neighbors and we're tight with them, then we can begin to rely on them for a little help, right? A little support. I get by with little help from my friends. I went from De La Soul to the Beatles. We can't, so for example, if I don't have any cash because I lost my job, and you don't have any cash because you lost your job, but I have a lawnmower and you're good at babysitting, maybe we could trade, right? I'll mow your lawn, you watch my kid. Oh, my car broke down, but I don't have any money, but I know Joe who knows, I don't know, Francesca, and Francesca is an amateur mechanic, and so she's going to come over and take a look at my car, in exchange for which I am going to bake her some muffins. Right? And so when you know the people around you, you can get by during an economic shock, because you can have these kinds of transitions that are outside of the formal transactions, rather, that are outside of the formal economy, where no cash needs to be exchanged. And so it makes communities more economically resilient. So these are all the reasons why social capital, Robert Putnam would argue, is important. And therefore, when we recognize that it's declining, when people aren't in the community, aren't in the PTA, aren't volunteering with Girl Scouts, aren't doing these things, and the numbers of participation are dropping off, then, we could say, well, this represents a problem, right? I mean, the thing that made our communities vibrant and safe and secure and economically resilient, like, we're losing that thing, and we need to do something to rebuild it. And I guess I said finally before, but I lied. With this audio recording thing, I can't actually go backwards. If I go backwards, everything gets erased, so that's annoying. But democracy and participation, right? So if we are invested in our communities, then our communities are going to be more democratic, and so decision making at the political level is going to represent our interests more fully, and that's important as well. But there's a dark side to social capital, right? There are problems with it, and generally the dark side comes when you've got a circumstance like a high, in that 4-quadrant diagram, where you've got more bonding and less bridging. And so if you've got lots of bonding but not so much bridging, that can create narrow-mindedness. If you've got lots of bonding but not so much bridging, you can have exclusionary kinds of tendencies where certain community groups don't want anything to do with other community groups. And this creates things like, xenophobia. It creates things like racism. It creates this sort of mentality, hey, you don't look like us, or you don't share our culture, or you don't come from where we come from, and therefore we want nothing to do with you, right? So high bonding and low bridging is sort of anathema to diversity. And diversity, of course, is also something that makes our places, our communities of place, vibrant and important and dynamic and interesting. And social capital, and can reinforce the elite sort of power structures in a community. So if social capital is concentrated disproportionately in the hands of certain people and not in the hands of other people, then it can reinforce this sort of power structure. Gangs, right? So we talked about this a minute ago, gangs being a good example of high bonding and low bridging social capital. And NIMBY, which is a acronym that stands for not in my backyard. And so we see this a lot with things like around here, for example, wind turbines, right? Wind turbines are super controversial, which is dumb, by the way, in my official opinion. Wind turbines are super controversial, and so like people will be like, oh, I don't want those anywhere near my house, right? Oh, you can have them on your property, but not in my backyard, right? And so when you have a certain or sort of low social capital or low bridging or that sort of thing, then it can create this kind of NIMBY idea, or like, oh, you want to build a jail, and you want it to, it's an economic development project that's going to create jobs and tax revenue for the city. Well, that sounds great, but you know what? Not in my backyard, right? So that's NIMBY, right? Not in my backyard. So, okay, so we've established that social capital is important. We've established what it is. We've established that it is declining. What we haven't talked about yet is why social capital is declining. And so Robert Putnam has kind of done this study in which he lays out why it's declining. He gives us a bunch of different reasons, but he starts by sort of basically critiquing all of the common arguments or commonly mobilized ideas for why social capital is declining. So the first of these arguments is the idea that the welfare state is responsible for the decline in social capital. And the welfare state is kind of another way of thinking about what maybe conservative politicians might refer to as big government. And so, the argument goes, well, we've got a strong welfare state, with big sort of national policies that kind of dictate things for communities rather than giving communities autonomy. And so, but Putnam is not really convinced that that's a big factor in the decline of social capital. He says maybe a little bit, but really it's insignificant. Another commonly sort of mobilized argument is, well, the dissolution of the traditional family, right? I mean, divorce rates are high and these sorts of things, and lots of single parents or same-sex parents and these sorts of things, and so there's a common argument that suggests that that this kind of transformation in the sort of norms around families in our society has something to do with the decline of social capital. Putnam is not convinced that that's the case. Of course, it's not the case. It's a ridiculous and shamefully homophobic kind of argument to make, but an argument, unfortunately, that many people do make. But Putnam finds no evidence that that actually has to do with the decline in social capital. What about racism, right? This is a white supremacist society, and does that have to do with things? So, we're high levels of homophily, where people like to be around the sort of people that look like them, come from the same places that they do. Well, maybe a little bit, but he doesn't find a whole lot of support for that kind of an argument either. Globalization, so Wendell Berry, Bill McKibben, these guys. Putnam actually doesn't find a lot of support for that argument either. He says, theoretically, there's no reason why globalization should diminish social capital, but in practice, maybe a little bit. But then we start getting into the main problems. And not number one, but one of the main problems is work and economic pressures, right? We're asked to work more hours than our predecessors were, and our real wages are lower than those of our predecessors. Our benefits are less than those of our predecessors. And so the ramping up of the sort of work pressure and economic pressure on households has a lot to do with the decline in social capital. We're working all the time, we're busy, and we're stressed all the time, and so we aren't in the community. We aren't around because we can't afford to be. What about suburbanization and sprawl, right? So our communities of place are sprawling out. They're getting less population dense. We've got bigger houses, farther distances to travel between work and houses, and so we've got to drive everywhere and these sorts of things. And so this isolates us from our community. It isolates us from our neighbors. Big houses, big tall fences. We can't even see into our neighbors' yards. So we don't get to know them. We're in a car all the time. It's like our own personal little climate-controlled bubble, rather than walking or biking or being on the street where we might see people and have an opportunity to interact with them. We're in a car all the time, and so suburbanization and sprawl has something to do with the decline of social capital as well. TV, 25% of the decline. So work and economic pressure is 10% of the decline. Suburbanization and sprawl, 10% of the decline. TV is 25%. And instead of TV, we could actually think of this as screens, right? And so it's not just TV, but it's devices, it's tablets, it's computers, it's Twitter, it's Facebook, it's, you know, Instagram, it's all these things. These are the things that keep us, screens in general, electronics, are the things that keep us disconnected from our communities. And then finally, he refers to this, the biggest percentage of all is ideological generational change. And this is the idea that, you know, younger generations are just less interested, for whatever set of reasons, just less interested in being active in the community. Alright, so I want us to change gears a little bit. So we're going to go back in time. I want to talk about this phenomenon called urban renewal. And this is a phenomenon that sort of came around in our cities in the 1940s and 50s. So the urban planning orthodoxy, the sort of common conventional way that urban planning was done in the 1940s and 50s, was what subsequently became referred to as urban renewal. The 1940s and 50s were a time of what we might refer to as high modernism in our cities, and in fact in our society more broadly. And high modernism, one way to think of high modernism is as a time when science and expertise came to dominate almost everything that we did. And so the 40s and 50s were a time of sort of social engineering, a time in which we believed that experts knew better than we did. And so this manifested itself, you know, also, so not only was it a time of high modernism, but also in the sort of mid-20th century, our cities were going through a kind of tumultuous period where they, because of the Industrial Revolution and mass migrations from the agricultural South into the cities of the North and Midwest in the first decades of the 20th century, our cities grew very quickly, they grew very chaotically, very haphazardly, and they became places that hosted, you know, large slums. I mean, that's actually the literal word for these low-income neighborhoods that were, you know, where the housing was dilapidated, and you know, they were unsafe. They were just unsafe, unpleasant places to be. And so our cities were growing very quickly. You know, there were all kinds of sort of social problems in our cities in the first half of the 20th century. And so urban planning came along as a solution to these social problems. And it came along at a time in which, like, common everyday citizens were very willing to defer to and believe that it was appropriate to defer to experts and technicians and professionals and scientists and planners and engineers and these sorts of things. And so it was a very top-down era. It was an era when common citizens didn't have a lot of power or a lot of voice. People didn't think it was particularly important to listen to them. And so urban renewal was an effort a misguided, a horribly misguided, but very well intentioned effort to revitalize our cities, to refresh them. And it was based around large capital intensive infrastructure projects. So this was the era in which freeways and expressways were integrated into cities. This was the era in which those sort of like big, weird, four-leaf clover kinds of automobile ramp thingies were built into our cities. This was the era of like large bridges. This was the era of large infrastructure projects like ports and stadiums and harbors and all of these like very large, capital intensive, city government driven kinds of infrastructure projects. This is what characterized urban renewal. Also, it was a time in which single use zoning, or what is sometimes referred to as Euclidean zoning, became the sort of norm. And then finally, it was a time in which public housing projects were first built, right? So as I said, and when we next week when we watch this movie called The Pruitt-Igoe Myth, we will see this manifested in a very sort of specific case. But across the United States, slum housing was dilapidated. It was unsafe. There was no recourse. I mean, your roof could fall in on you, and there was no recourse. You couldn't do anything about it. Tenants in the slums had no power. The landlords, the literal slumlords, had all the power, and it was a horrible circumstance for people to be living in. And the cities, very well intentioned but tragically misguided, decided, well, public housing is the solution to this horrible slum housing, and so we will build these public housing high-rises, and they were called projects. And so this, like stadiums and ports and freeways, these public housing projects were big, city-built, capital-intensive infrastructure projects. So they fit along with all of these other things. And so this was urban renewal, and it was intended to revitalize and sort of clean up our cities. What it ended up doing was sort of sanitizing our cities in such a way that a lot of the vibrancy, a lot of the unique character of our cities was bulldozed. And so along came the great urban critic Jane Jacobs, and she wrote her most famous book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, in the early 1960s. She was originally from Canada, but was living in Greenwich Village in New York City. Living in Greenwich Village in New York City, and this was a bohemian community. It was a diverse place. It was a vibrant place. It was a bohemian place. People on the street all the time, all kinds of different people, and you ran into, when people are on the street all the time, you're always running into people, and you get to know people just from being around. And so Robert Moses, the sort of the famous architect, was trying to sanitize and kind of bulldoze Greenwich Village. And so Jane Jacobs organized people on behalf of Greenwich Village and was able to save it. And so in the sort of wake of that experience, wrote this book about what called The Death and Life of Great American Cities, and it's about what makes cities unique and special. And so she writes in this book, it's a critique of urban renewal. It's a critique of the high modernist, government-led social engineering of cities. The book came out in 1961, and in it she advocates neighborhoods that are denser, neighborhoods that are more diverse, and neighborhoods that are mixed use, zoned for mixed use rather than zoned for single use. And so let me go back actually and explain single-use zoning. Single-use zoning is it's the kind of zoning that we are familiar with. Zoning is the way in which cities control the development of land by land use type. Let me say that one more time. Zoning is the way that cities control the development of land by land use type. And so single-use zoning is a way of organizing real estate development that separates out land uses and keeps them separate. So, you know, this part north of Normal is zone. I'm just making this up. This isn't really real, but we'll just an example. This part north of Normal is zoned for agriculture, and so all the agriculture is going to happen in this section north of Normal. This section over here is zoned for single-use residential, so you can have houses, but you can only have houses at single family, and so you can't put apartment buildings or townhouses. It's all houses. Okay. This area over here is residential too, but this is multi-family residential, so you can put apartment buildings and townhouses over here. This area over here is zoned commercial, so you can build malls and big box stores and that sort of thing, strip malls over there. And then this area over here is zoned light industrial, so you can have some manufacturing over there. And then this area back over here is heavy industrial. And so, in other words, every different kind of land use is kept separate from one another. That's the way most of our places are organized. It's an artifact of the 1950s. It didn't really exist before that, and so, you know, and it's an artifact of urban renewal. And Jane Jacobs was a critique of this idea. She felt that you should have mixed-use areas, and so you should be able to live and work and shop all on the same block. So factories, office buildings, residential areas, and commercial areas all on the same block, right? And having that kind of mixed use kept things more vibrant, kept things more dynamic. I feel like I've said vibrant like 80,000 times in this recording. It's my favorite word today. But anyway, whatever other synonyms for the word vibrant, these are the things that you know, mixed-use zoning, according to Jane Jacobs, would produce. So she was a critique of urban renewal. She was a she wrote a critique. She critiqued. She criticized. I don't know what I'm saying. Urban renewal. And so these neighborhoods, like Greenwich Village, she thought were safe and vibrant and fair, and created community. So, in contrast to urban renewal, the sort of design orthodoxy that has emerged, it's actually not an orthodoxy yet, but it is gaining momentum over the past couple of decades, is called New Urbanism. And so I just want to warn you for like tests and papers and stuff. Urban renewal and New Urbanism, they sound a lot alike. They both have the words new and urban in them. They are totally different things, so be very careful not to confuse urban renewal with New Urbanism. Alright? New Urbanism is basically like the opposite of urban renewal. So New Urbanism is this design idea that has come about in the last 20 years that advocates exactly what Jane Jacobs was arguing: mixed use neighborhoods, mixed use communities, except that it applies these principles out in the suburbs as well as in the cities. And so it builds suburbs that have, so this image that you're seeing on this slide here, you can see like there's retail on the bottom floor, there's housing on the top, on the second and third floors, and then next to that there's like a trailer, and next to that there's like a giant mansion, and behind that there's an office building. And so you can, there's commercial, there's residential of 3 different kinds, and there's work, right, all on the same block. New Urbanism. Taking those principles of mixed use that Jane Jacobs was advocating and applying them in the suburbs. Uptown Normal. Uptown Normal would be a good example. You can live there, you can work there, you can shop there. Uptown Normal would be a good example. Even that Main Street corridor is kind of an example, sort of on the west side of campus, on the other side of Main Street, with the flats, you know. there's all that retail on the bottom and you can live on the top and that sort of thing. And so new urbanism is a response to urban sprawl, and it's an effort to kind of return to this pre-war aesthetic back before urban renewal kind of sanitized and transformed our cities. Mixed use and mixed income zoning. Okay, so mixed use, retail, residential, commercial, all together, and mixed income, right? Apartments, trailer, mansion, all on the same block. So it brings more diversity into